My name is Bethany Wiggin, and I'm the faculty director. 5 years ago, working with Penn students, I co-founded the pilot program of PPEH, and 2 years ago, we received generous support from the Mellon Foundation to make the program a permanent part of the School of Arts and Sciences. Environmental humanities are animated by the conviction that we must make an effort to inhabit a difficult space of simultaneous critique and action. In the words of feminist philosopher Rosie Braidotti, quote, "We need to connect critique to creativity and invent new ways of thinking, interwoven lines of post-human critique, because we cannot solve problems in the same language we use to create them." The pulse of connections between critique and creativity animate this nascent field, the environmental humanities, and they lie at the heart of this 3-day convening of researchers who explore diverse waters in the era of climate change and whose concerns span the arts and sciences, bridging basic and applied research, including storytelling and science communication. Tonight, in the wake of Screening Rod's Toxicity, our conversations around teaching, learning, and living begin all together now. We'll start with 3 solo voices and then proceed to a moderated dialogue with the keynote plenarists, Bill Dennison, Rachel Price, and Rod Coover. In our program's third movement, we invite you to add your words and voices using a tool that Bill introduced us to, the Menti software. You'll be able to enter a code on your smartphone. Instructions will be on the screen, and all of your comments and questions will be aggregated on the screens in front of you, and we'll approach your questions and comments both individually and in the aggregate. Our speakers tonight are experts in science and science communication. That's Bill, humanistic critique, Rachel, and visual research and filmmaking, Rod. Bill and the Integrated Application Network at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science has developed various narrative forms, including community-based report cards on watershed health. Rachel writes widely about aesthetics and slaveholding in the Iberian Atlantic, about petrocultures, and about Cuban artists in particular, their responses to warming waters. Rod's research with new media and with new media opens lines of sight into possible futures and their losses. Their full bios, as well as many of your full bios, are in the programs, so beautifully made by Rachel Ishikawa, and I invite you to read them in full there. Together, we'll take up the possibilities of interdisciplinary collaboration across these diverse modes and methods of apprehending rapidly changing coastal areas. Over the last few weeks, Bill, Rachel, and Rod, we've developed a shared set of concerns, and we'll explore them in our conversation. They include, and I'm just going to read you, imagine bullet points in your head. Bullet point. The difficulty of communication across disciplinary cultures with their distinct languages and habits. Also including the tension between the urgency of the current moment and the long duration of this moment's making. We'll consider what happens when we consider water in the plural, culturally and historically situated, rather than a universal everywhere and always H2O. We'll discuss the possibility of slow science, the need to democratize research, and the work of decolonizing the academy. And we'll address the concern that the university itself may be as much part of the problem as a solution to the challenges of envisioning and creating more just and less carbon-intensive worlds. Generosity emblazons the banner of the best work in environmental humanities. And before we get underway, it's my great pleasure to thank all of you for being here, and to thank especially our speakers and commenters, many of whom have traveled a great distance to be here, some closer to home, and all of you have agreed to volunteer your time. Special thanks also go to the Penn Water Center, who generously volunteered co-sponsorship of this event, and most importantly, refreshments. Our thanks too to the staff here at the Perry World House, as well as the Wolf Humanities Center, where all events on Friday and Saturday take place, with the very notable exception of tomorrow's participatory art science exercise, the embodied scientist parkour developed by the Environmental Performance Agency, sitting mostly in the front row and standing. 4 agents are with us. This quartet has been with us pretty off and on all year at the PPEH. We've begun to refer to you, I don't know if you know this, as the real EPA. We've been working together with them as they've developed the parkour since the summer. And a small invited group of students and program fellows and guests traversed the parkour course one time already this fall. They have developed for you a handout on what to expect for tomorrow. Please do pick it up, read it carefully, and please, please do not forget your raincoats. Unfortunately, it does look wet. So it's in keeping with our program, but nonetheless, better to have a raincoat on. The buses for the event will leave from the Wolf Humanities Center at Williams Hall tomorrow promptly at 10. Alternatively, you can meet us at the trailhead, which is at Gray's Crescent. Your embodied research is vital to the project, and we thank you in advance for exercising with us. Most especially, I'd like to thank PPEH's ACE team, Rachel Ishikawa, thanks Rachel, and Managing Director Dr. Meg Ehrenberg, without whose hard work, Meg in the back, you should all thank her a ton, she's done so much work, without whose hard work and talent this event simply could not have happened. Since 2016, PPEH has piloted on-water teaching and learning engagements under the banner of the Schuylkill River Research Corps, including the On-Water Research Intensive, which we held last year in June, as well as the ongoing 3-year program, Rising Waters, Philadelphia and Mumbai, funded by a School of Arts and Sciences Making a Difference in Diverse Communities Award. Several speakers tomorrow and Saturday will explore these initiatives more fully, and we really are eager to have the opportunity to learn from our invited guests further afield, all expert in engaging diverse communities on water. Over the next 2 days, we'll hear from scientists, humanists, and artists working on, around, in, and with the Delaware, the Hudson, Passaic, Susquehanna, and Mississippi rivers in North America, as well as on the Madre and Magdalena rivers in Colombia, the River Severn in the UK, the Arno in Florence, the Lagos Lagoon, and Indonesian waters, or as Rachel Thompson correctly insisted in her email to me, Dutch Indonesian waters. Now, as some of you know, I've been thinking for a few years now about boats, not surprisingly, perhaps in an age of rising waters. And before I introduce, and before we turn it over to Bill, Rachel, and Rod, I want to say just one last thing about boats. And I'll do so by showing you a 2-minute film clip in which you'll hear PPEH fellow alumna Anna Alonso, and then me, in a short documentary made by Brooke Seatonson about last year's June On Water Intensive. I taught this together with Peter DiCarlo, who just moved, there he is, also with David Valinsky, Jacob Rivkin, and Roland Wall. Many people who were involved in that are also here today and will be with us over the next 2 days. And I want to make sure to thank them also. And also, I want to introduce that field school to this gathering, not least because we are eager to learn from and with you about how it might be reinvented and reconfigured for future years. So here's the, oh, I forgot to show you this. This is happening tomorrow. You must come. It's quite marvelous.
I think a lot of the exercises that we did at the On Water Intensive were really geared toward promoting this bidirectional flow between community members and research. So on the one hand, having community members use the research in various aspects of the Schuylkill River and their projects, whether that be creating educational materials or helping people understand their health as it relates to the river. And on the other hand, having community members become stakeholders in research on the Schuylkill River.
We really wanted to be on boats, in part because we wanted to be able to look at certain bioindicators in the water that we could only really measure from a boat. But there's something incredibly powerful about the boat as a metaphor. We're thinking about the kind of collaborative communities we need that will keep us afloat in a watery future. We're thinking about the ethics of collaboration. Who floats in? Who floats out? And so that's what we're really practicing. And we really believe that it's these collaborations that can lead to effective action on climate.
So in addition to thinking, as I've been thinking figuratively about boats, I've really been rereading the philosopher of science Otto Neurath. Otto Neurath was also a social scientist and a visual educator and the so-called maverick leader of the Vienna Circle, where he was active before fleeing Austria in 1934. In Neurath's essay of 1921, Anti-Spengler, he compared the body of human knowledge to a boat that must be repaired at sea. Quote, "We are like sailors who on the open sea must reconstruct their ship, but never able to start afresh from the bottom." The enterprise of rebuilding the Ark of Knowledge while out at sea is a fitting figure, I think, for an on-water intensive no less than this gathering called Teaching and Learning with Rising Waters. I invite you to think with it, too, as we consider how to reconstruct the ship without sinking the whole enterprise. So let's embark, and we'll begin with remarks from Bill Dennison, followed by Rachel, and then Rod.
In our planning session, I decided to call this Blinded with Science, the Thomas Dolby song. You know, she blinded me with science, science. So let me tell you about my journey. It started when I was a graduate student at the University of Alaska, and my advisor, as I sketched with a pencil, said, well, just put that in your thesis. Take those drawings. So I took the little pen and did that, and then when I went and did my PhD, I did the same thing, and it took me hours. So you have to, each dot there is a little point, use a rapidograph, this old-fashioned black pen, and then sketch those out. And then when I did a postdoc in Long Island, same thing, when we had this conceptualization of what these brown tides, these unique to science, new form of algal blooms occurred, killing all the scallops, and the bay scallops in the Peconic Bays. So it's pretty crude drawing, I mean, not very fancy. But then I had a chance to go to Australia, and the key thing, it's a kind of fuzzy photo, but the one on the left, you'll see a refrigerator. And that was the graduate student kind of bullpen in my group, marine botany group. And I had a secretary, an assistant that was in art school. You know, art school doesn't pay very well, so she was working hourly. And during lunch break, she would go and paint the fridge and put mangroves and seagrasses and corals on the fridge. And we're like, that's really nice. And people would come from all over campus to look at our fridge. So we said, well, can we use that? And so we started stylizing with Corel Draw at the time, like in the logo there. And we became involved in this Healthy Waterways campaign, and we started doing these graphics for books. And this first book of a series, The Crew Guide, we had a diagram where we put these symbols together, and the one on the bottom shows a transition between the fresh water that comes in and the brown turbid water giving way to the green algal bloom, giving way to the blue water. And so that brown, green, blue became our theme and our logo. And so we found that the color was a way to help express what was happening in nature. So we started using that in a whole variety of publications. We put them in newsletters. We actually published them in scientific journals, posters, reports, books. And we found it really more engaging than black and white with maybe a photo sprinkled in. So then I had a chance to come back to the United States and after 10 years in Australia. And I was recruited to the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science because they redefined scholarship. Typically, the way you measure scholarship universities is teaching, research, and service. In this case, they used this model that Joe Boyer put together called discovery, integration, application, and teaching. So what's integration application? Well, the overall thing is using science to make change happen. Since the University of Maryland's down by Chesapeake Bay, the scientists were tired of watching the bay decline and documenting the decline. They wanted to make change. So we created an integration application network to deal with those pillars of scholarship. In a quick summary of what I think it is a left brain, right brain thing. So on one side, to study problems, you have to be objective and dispassionate, but to solve problems, you say, I care about this bay, this river, this place. To study problems, you have to embrace the complexity. To solve problems, you have to make it simple. To study problems, you have to use your peer review system for funding, for publication, but in solving problems, you're working with stakeholders, and that's a very different peer review. Ultimately, studying problems is getting it right, no matter how many drafts, no matter how many times it takes. But solving problems, you have windows of opportunity and you have to get it done. So this is difficult. It's right brain, left brain. How do we deal with a right brain, left brain? Corpus callosum that connects it. And that's where Einstein's brain was significantly different than others. He had a big corpus callosum. So we're trying to use integration application as the corpus callosum of studying and solving problems. We're trying to build environmental intelligence. We use, and I consider a revolution in the sensors that we have out there with remote sensing, in situ. They're cheaper and faster, and we can gather more data than ever before. And then we take that data, and we're starting to develop ways to process that data, to analyze it with statistics and geographic information systems and spatial analysis and models. And then we synthesize and visualize the data, and that's some of the stuff that my group's been working on. We have a synthesis center in Annapolis, Maryland, and we have developed science visualization techniques. Ultimately, it's because communicating good science effectively in a timely manner can make a difference. So we've been producing science communication products using that intensely visual style. We're producing environmental report cards. A few weeks ago, we released the report card for the Everglades, Florida, and another one for the Tool River in Mongolia. That's our Chesapeake Bay report card that we do every year. We're releasing that in a couple weeks, and other places around the world. It's part of what I call democratizing science. We're also taking these symbols that we use to make diagrams and making it widely available to people using the web. So we have about 3,000 symbols. We're about halfway to Pidgin English. You know, you can get by with about 5,000 words in Pidgin. So we're creating a global language, culturally independent. A pig's a pig. Doesn't matter where you're coming from. And we've had people from every country sign up and register and download those symbols. They're free. And then they can use it to click and drag and make their own conceptual diagrams. So disciplinarity. Bethany and Rod and Rachel and I talked about this a bit, so I made this slide to talk about transdisciplinary, which is a term that scientists love to use these days. And so we can think of it as academic interdisciplinarity. So that's where academics talk to other academics, and so there's a project we did on Chesapeake Bay seagrass water quality, and you can see we had about 6 academic institutions. Practitioners, in the case that we've been working with NGOs and agencies, and stakeholders. And so in preparation for tomorrow with the Mississippi River, we did a report card on the Mississippi River, and that's just a photo in St. Louis where one of the many meetings we had with different stakeholders. And to do that report card, we measured transportation, the barges. So we had the Ingram Barge Company there at the table. We had the Army Corps of Engineers who regulated the locks and the dams. We had the EPA folks and the Ducks Unlimited and Nature Conservancy. So you bring all those together. And what I like to try to do is transcend disciplines with the graph on the left is a data graph, typical scientific data graph. It happens to be seagrass over time. But then we use the art, which is the conceptualization of that process, explaining what's happening with the graph using that diagram. And then in the social science realm, we're getting more and more into that with social network analysis, and we did oral histories in Puerto Rico right after Hurricane Maria and a prolonged drought. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of where scientists, much more famous and better than me, have blended art and poetry. And so what I've taken is the words directly from, this is Copernicus's book, Revolution of Celestial Bodies, which he published in 1543 on his deathbed, which rocked the world. The Copernican revolution was all about the Earth not being in the center of the solar system, but in fact, the heliocentric sun in the middle. And that drawing he drew is of the sun in the middle. So it's not a great drawing, but it's a powerful drawing. Changed the world, changed how people think. So Copernicus wrote, "The consensus of many centuries has sanctioned the conception that the earth remains at rest in the middle of the heaven. As its center would, I reflected, regard it as an insane pronouncement if I made the opposite assertion that the earth moves." Remember that term. Because the guy that came after him, Galileo, Copernicus was a Polish scientist. Galileo was an Italian born in Pisa, and he invented a telescope. And so he wrote, "I have discovered 4 planets, neither known nor observed by any of the astronomers, all which facts were discovered and observed a few days ago by the help of a telescope devised by me through God's grace, first enlightening my mind." So he wrote this book, The Starry Messenger, and he drew these. This is the view of the moon from his telescope, and beautiful drawings. And his entire book is interspersed with beautiful drawings of the things that he was observing. And Copernicus was smart enough to die upon the revelation of this heliocentric universe. Galileo was arrested, and he was being, he had the Spanish Inquisition trying him for heresy. So he had to, and he spent the rest of his life after that Inquisition in house arrest. But after he had to publicly denounce the Copernican heliocentric world, the most famous aside, he said, "And yet it moves, the earth moves." My last example is Charles Darwin, and he wrote a book called The Structure and Distribution of Cories, 20 years before he wrote the more famous book, Origin of Species. So and this is the final paragraph of the second edition of his book, and this is, I thought, a beautiful language. "A grand and harmonious picture of the movements which the crust of the earth has undergone. We see vast areas rising. We see other wide spaces sinking. We may feel sure that the movement has been so slow as to have allowed the corals to grow up to the surface, and so widely extended as to have buried over the face of the ocean every one of those mountains, above which the atolls now stand like monuments, marking the place of their burial." And then this little woodcut that he drew, and on the woodcut you can see a little boat at the top and a little palm tree for scale, and that's the extinct dead volcano with the tombstone, the limestone tombstone on top of it, the coral reef. Beautiful metaphor, beautifully written. So those are 3 of what I call the dead white men here that changed the world through the way their science made people think differently about their place in the universe. Copernican revolution that revolutionized where people thought we were in relation to the sun and the planets. Galileo, and remember the famous dropping the cannonballs from the top of the Tower of Pisa, discovering that gravity was universal. German, Johann Kepler, looking at the orbit of planets around the sun 50 years later. And then Isaac Newton with the laws of thermodynamics, the British scientist. And then the Swedish Carl Linnaeus, who took all the ships of discovery that were coming back and making sense of it with the Linnaean system. The French chemist Lavoisier, the British geologist Lyell, Darwin, Einstein at the beginning of the 20th century, revolutionizing the theory of relativity, and then Watson Crick and Rosalind Franklin, who put together the three-dimensional structure of DNA that started us off on our current biological revolution. Why were these scientists chasing these things? They're trying to figure out where we were in the universe, what we were made of, where we came from. What do we need now? We need to know how we can survive on this planet sustainably. And that's our big challenge. And so my hope is that instead of a dead white man, we'll have another photo in there, and somebody can help us using science figure out how we can live sustainably on this planet for the next century. Thank you very much.
We have, as you see, very little time. So I'll first speak about some approaches to how cultural practices, from art to activism in the environmental humanities, have inspired my own work, and then share a glimpse of some of that research. So I won't go into the many fields, oceanic studies, environmental history that one could bring in for talking about rising waters, but I'll just identify a few, I think, promising ways of thinking for me. Until about a year and a half ago, when we talked about this when we were planning, I mentioned I actually doubted whether the humanities had much to offer in the way of either intervening into environmental crises or slowing climate change, even of conceiving of how to do those things. Then, in December 2017, I participated in a workshop at the SARS Institute in Uruguay, the South American Institute for Resilience and Sustainability Studies, which brought together scientists and humanists for a 3-day conference. So we did kind of humanist conferences and also scientific research all together. At one point over a meal, I was talking with a scientist, and I confessed my doubts, and he said, that he disagreed, that humanists actually did have something to contribute, because he said something that really changed my mind. He said, in many areas, including climate change, we may have all the science and evidence that we need to know what we need to do. And the problem is that we don't have the political will or the kind of cultural practices to make those changes. And ever since he said that, I changed my mind completely, and I decided that there is actually urgent place for the environmental humanities. And as environmental and financial regulations continue to be gutted, both in the United States and more dangerously for the world in Brazil, where the Amazon has been the single greatest break on CO2 levels in the past years, more than other forms of reducing CO2 levels, I've changed my mind completely. Grappling with environmental crisis and climate change is a deeply cultural and aesthetic challenge as well. But even when I had my doubts, I was already working on environmental questions because they seemed to me urgent and inescapable, whether in the contemporary moment or the historical one. So my area of specialty is Latin America, where the arrival of Europeans inaugurated abiding patterns of extreme resource and labor extraction. So if you do environmental history, you can see many of contemporary patterns already established 400 or 500 years ago. Still, I struggle to understand how culture might engage questions of, say, extractivist industries, toxic pollution, appropriation of indigenous lands, or rising sea levels in ways that were not only mimetic. So in other words, I was interested in what the humanities could do beyond novels about rising water or paintings of trees or poems about nature. Because while I think these works can be important for something like consciousness raising, first, I don't know if there's evidence to suggest that this kind of work produces a change, and this is something we can think about. But secondly, I felt like that was not something that the humanities themselves were actually contributing. It was sort of a reflection of what science maybe was doing. And I thought, what is it that the humanities can do sort of uniquely? There must be something proper to those disciplines that can be offered. Although I do think, so novels about rising waters like the Kim Stanley Robinson New York 2046, which came out a year or two ago, or a novel I worked on, Havana Underwater, are important ways of imagining a near future. But I was trying to figure out non-mimetic ways. So I turned to a few thinkers, philosophers, sociologists, activists, literary critics, who focused on more ontological or fundamental ways that cultural practices and thought affect environmental relations and respond to them. For instance, in his search to understand what has brought us to the present world, and it's our relationship to the world, the philosopher Michael Marder has pointed to the ways that Aristotelian notions of energy linger on today in many extractivist relationships to the earth. And so he talks about two notions of energy in Aristotle: energeia, completed or fulfilled energy, as opposed to dunamis, an energy imagined as potential and that we have to kind of hoard and use up. So he says dunamis is dynamite. That is the unconscious image of energy nestled in our psyches. To obtain it, we must extract it, wrest it from others, human or not, animate or inanimate, at the price of their wholeness. Energy extraction tears actual beings, the placeholders of the Aristotelian energeia, apart, obscenely exposing their entrails, enucleating them. So he's trying to see how this dunamis concept is kind of metaphorized or instantiated in actual dynamite as a means of extraction. Another example of how thinking about climate is inextricable from our larger philosophies can be seen in the way that the business of extraction presumes certain kinds of time in ways that become prophetic. For example, the burning and processing of hydrocarbons contributes to the same climate change and stronger hurricanes that affect the petroleum industry itself, which then bolsters its risk management. The more fossil fuels are burned, the more dangerous deep-sea extraction becomes, and so on. As Lee Johnson writes about the oil industry in the Gulf of Mexico, an enormous density of financial instruments inhabit this temporal space: energy derivatives, storm-specific futures, seasonal hurricane futures, and so on. Ultimately, he argues, financial derivatives devalue any temporal politics that is not about the near future. So again, trying to bring together how certain philosophies inform certain practices that then kind of feed back into thinking about time itself. Whereas these thinkers have all worked within a legacy of first classical and then romantic Western thought and practice, sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui from Bolivia, anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena, various Amerindian thinkers and contributors to Ecuador's 2008 constitution declaring the rights of nature, all draw on other philosophical traditions to re-articulate human relations with the non-human world. Cusicanqui has analyzed visual culture, drawings, paintings, quipus, and other artworks from the Andes to argue for a different practice of imagining totality, the world, employing Andean representational strategies and theories of vision. So she argues that the structuring function of quipus, or the idea of taquis, which is a code of collective responsibility, survived the colonial invasion and reshaped the kind of spaces of the Andes along new axes of power, so different forms of conceiving of the world around us. So what then does it mean to think about the global ocean and rising sea levels from a cultural perspective, which again is also a scientific and a representational one? What for medieval European cartographers was a non plus ultra filled with monsters is now a privileged site for interspecies anthropology and studies of the essence of life itself, visible in the work of anthropologist Stefan Helmreich. So I'm just going to kind of give a list of different approaches that I think have been productive and may continue to be so. In microbiological research into the last universal common ancestor, in Nicole Starosielski's mapping of the undersea cables that enable the digital cloud, there's now also an environmental history being done by Nathan Ensmenger on the environmental history of computing, where he talks about how much water is needed for the cloud to cool the Google centers. It can look like the work of Malik Rahim, an environmental and social justice activist in New Orleans, who in the post-Katrina world drew on his experience with the Black Panthers and co-founded Common Ground Collective, which provided food, water, health clinics, debris removal, legal advocacy, and wetlands restoration, and whose work I learned of from my colleague Josh Guild. Or Puerto Rican artist Javier Rodriguez's El Almacén, a studio for teaching about solar installation after Hurricane Maria. Thinking about rising sea levels from a cultural perspective can look like understanding how global warming is tied to political economy, So here's an example anticipating now, moving into the art realm, our next speaker. This work by Hito Steiro, Liquidity Inc., which was about water, but also financial liquidity. It can mean an environmental historian, Molly Warsh's recent book, uncovering how Iberian technologies and custody of pearl fisheries, an extractive industry from the 1500s, already depended upon indigenous knowledge of underwater depressions and the purported sounds of rooting that the oysters made 20 fathoms down. It could also look like reseeding oyster beds, which is another project that's been taken on by the engineer artist Natalie Jeremijenko. It might mean understanding the current scramble to extend national rights in the seabed floor as part of a history dating to Hugo de Grotius' 1609 Freedom of the Seas, or the Spanish theorist Francisco de Vitoria's treatises that inspired Grotius, and which justified war against indigenous peoples in the Americas because they were obstructing European access to the commons, and he included the waves as part of that. But as Bethany said in the beginning, critique and understanding is not sufficient. We also need to understand a range of philosophical and cultural histories that have always seen the ocean or other waterways in very different ways and implement changes. And then just sort of to look at a couple examples as I've tried to put them into practice. In my previous research, I examined how contemporary Cuban art was thinking about rising oceans in both, again, representational and sort of non-representational ways. So I'll just show you maybe 6 slides, examples, as you can see how people are already reflecting on flood conditions and kind of imagining a post-flood world, which has only come to pass more since this book came out in 2015. And then I looked in particular at one artist who tried to go beyond only representing and also think on, again, on the level of ontology of a different way of being. So this was an artist who made salt faux photographs, he was also a photographer, of images of glaciers that circulated on the internet, but the glaciers had now changed their shape since the original photographs. And so he was interested in signaling that just as digital photography has lost its actual referent in the world, so certain aspects of the natural world have lost their contours. And so it was an attempt to sort of think beyond just showing us a picture about how thinking about aesthetics can teach us something about extinction or time. And I'm currently, just to wrap up, I'm currently writing on how a mid-century abstract artist, Sandu Darrier, understood his theories of abstraction in terms of theories of energy. So he did kind of typical period abstraction, but I was interested in how these ideas carried over into his work, for example, in a 1969 film about petroleum extraction and the ways in which certain forms of representation, there was a kind of abstraction that went with the research into extraction that he was doing. And I was particularly interested in one of his final pieces, which he did for a 1975 Okinawa World Exhibition called The Sea We Want to See. And he made an immersive experience for this World Exhibition where he tried to recreate the feeling of the ocean floor. This was the floating city that they constructed for the exhibition, whose original plan was to be kind of sunk to the seafloor, and actually in the way that this exhibition brought together thinking about warming seas and environmental crisis with kind of capitalist exploitation. It was maybe going to be an offshore oil drilling platform. It was eventually disassembled. So here I'll just finish with a couple of slides from what this exhibition focused on. So many leading industrial engineering firms built pavilions that tried to create what the future of the ocean might be. So either immersion or the sound of the ocean. People predicted that in the future humans would again breathe water. And I guess what I'd like to rescue from this is, although it was both part of a tourism campaign for Okinawa and sort of a show place for all these even mining firms like Sumitomo, I think there was also the kind of promise of science in terms of what it could do for improving ocean ecology. And I think maybe we could try to think about that as a moment in which art and science were trying to simultaneously think together a future experience of living in water. So.
The goal for the symposium for me is to expand my thinking about how the arts, sciences, and humanities might work together to address one of the greatest issues of our time, if not our existence, or at least our failure to address these. Tomorrow I'll talk about my art practices, so today is more about building a conversation. In particular, coming from the arts, I'm interested in how knowledge succeeds and fails to transform consciousness, to transform our cultural paradigms, the paradigms by which we live, and the imagery or iconography that reinforces those realities, such as that of the globe and of Google Maps, because the current paradigm, built on 19th century legacies of the Industrial Revolution and other revolutions of the 19th and 20th century, are simply not sustainable. Sustaining is not sustainable. We may also ask if the 19th century models of education, governance, technological reliance are not also part of the problem, feeding back to support the system of which they are a part, one which consumes our dissonance. So I'd like to begin perhaps with a children's story, which I often read to my 7-year-old, called The Seven Blind Mice. The story is based on an ancient parable of the Asian peninsula about 7 blind men. You probably know it. The original story is an ancient one. It's found in Buddhist texts and Hindu texts and Jain texts. And its meanings have somewhat varied over time. But anyway, let's launch in. In this story, something shows up in a pond. Each day a mouse goes out, a blind mouse, to try and understand what's in the pond. On one day, the red mouse goes out. He bumps into something very hard and reports back that it must be a column. And of course, no one believes him. And the next day, the green mouse arrives at something else that moves. He thinks it must be a snake, and on it goes until the 7th day, as you know, when the white mouse goes out to investigate, running up and down and all around, and he deduces what is solid and soft and stringy and leathery and flappy and big. It must be an elephant. And so the book concludes with the mouse parable, as the writer puts it, that it might make a good story to tell about the parts, but wisdom comes from seeing the whole. It's a somewhat problematic deduction, I think. And so I'd like to turn to another example of this, a film called The Letter on the Blind for the Use of Those Who See. It's a film by Javier Tellez, and it presents the accounts of 6 blind people who are invited to actually encounter an elephant. And in this film, each person goes out one by one and meets the elephant, touches it, and talks about their experience. They smell it. They walk around it. And what they translate is something far richer than what we see. In fact, it undermines the sense that seeing the whole tells the whole story. That actually it's through a multisensory approach that we begin to uncover memories, experiences of what the world is like to someone who is blind, that begins to expand the reality that is reduced by the image of the elephant. In other terms, as Michel Desceteaux famously illustrates in the book, The Practice of Everyday Life, the temporal knowledge of walking in a crowded city in New York City is very different from the illusion of order from above, from looking down from a tower. The actual temporal action relies on spontaneous choices, movements, utterances, chants, collective actions, always in flux. And of course, buildings fall down. The same arguments might be said about the authority of satellite views and Google Maps. The iconography that transforms our optical unconscious attempts to bring order and bring a spatial pattern against the complexities of time. This is a point that Bruno Latour makes in his book Facing Gaia about the images of the planet Earth. The image constructs an idea for us that isn't entirely wrong, but not entirely right either. It is helpful in some ways, but the dominance of an image can be very unhelpful in others. It is a picture of everything from nowhere that marvels and abstracts like an icon of a new theology. Like Desauter's view from New York on top of the World Trade Center, the globe constructs a spatial sense of the whole. However, perhaps if we think of what sustains life, maybe to begin with, we need to think about a narrow band, a dynamic narrow band, a few miles down, a little ways up into the atmosphere. Not something round and total, but something in flux, something that doesn't have as clear a shape. That space where life can exist and happens, and life is a thing that is dynamic, not an object, but an event, something caught up with time, something caught up with interactions and being and moments. Latour also argues against the concept of humans as separate individuals living with or in nature. Humans are porous creatures. Our environments pass through us and we pass through them, and in fact, many believe borders are indistinguishable. We have far more exchange than our conscious mind is aware of, even this dubious sense of our senses, as mice approaching the elephant tried to express, only give a tiny indication of the complexity of interactions taking place with our bodies and the world around us. We have senses all over our bodies, inside and out, all sending signals to our mind and to our systems. We are, as many like Michael Tausig have written, nervous systems, and so are our cultures. We respond through stimuli, and that stimuli hits us first unconsciously, hits us through all our different kind of perceptive facilities, and transform us, and we respond, and only later do we begin to think about that response. And so too do we, as cultures in many sense, in these environments, receiving and responding stimuli. This is among the reasons why I'm interested in combinatory films, among others, in art, because I'm very interested in systems that change, move, alter, transform. I'm very interested in chance and encounters that move us and open up our experiences. But there's also something quite disturbing about our porous experience, because we're in environments that are also in flux, changing, and dangerous. We, of course, are in a period where there are plastics probably in the cups, in the coffee you're drinking, in the water you're holding, plastics in the air we are breathing, toxins in all the muds that get stirred up by floods. We live in a very in a world full that has been richly transformed and transforms us, because as porous beings, we are fully immersed in the environments around us. Which is to say, we are all really mutants now. And if we are to find a position of resilience or action, we do so from a position where the world itself is transformed and we are transformed with it. The word crisis is perhaps inadequate, as Latour points out, for our time, because crises suggest singular events we get over. We humans have created a mutation, and we are part of that mutation in a living experience that is transformed, and it is us who live that transformation and have to make choices within it. But it is also, in a sense, already irreparable. It can only be transformed again. The next generations, it's great to see the youth speaking up, because the next generations have every right to be very angry at the lack of action in transforming the conditions that continue to let these systems continue. Down on the streets, of course, the waters are rising, and a direct approach like those of the artist Gideon Mendel show this. He takes pictures of people in floods. What is someone else's today might be your tomorrow. The direct approach, using the conventions of portraiture, take the conventions with a slight twist. But by relying on conventions, his works remind us that if we don't change our ways, this is just the new normal. I also believe, however, there's a need for creative approaches that transform conventions of representation, disrupt the iconography, like the iconography of the planet, the globe, spaceship Earth, and try and find some interdisciplinary or hybrid routes to resistance, to resilience, to adaptation. Are our disciplines, schools, cities, images, and stories part of the solution or part of the problem? I think this is one of the dominant questions of our meeting over the next few days, well, today and tomorrow. How can we extend beyond the paradigms that we have? How can we transform our paradigms? And how can our systems help? Will they help? What do we need to do to make the mutations, the changes, the transformations that will allow us to address the issues of our time, because sustaining is not sustainable? Thank you.
We circulated questions amongst ourselves, but I wanted to actually start by picking up on this question really that I think you all really touched upon, which is the recycling of certain stories, certain images over and over again. I like to quote literary critic, environmental humanist Stephanie Foote, who works on trash, who recently told me, I realize some of the stories I work on are trash. They're really not very good. And I wondered, in the stories and the images that we're circulating together, one of the things that we've talked about are ways that humanists might be able to tell stories that would be helpful to scientists, and perhaps vice versa. Ways that, I remember, Rod, you saying to Bill, what could we do that would be helpful to you? And Bill immediately saying to both of you, well, what can I do that would be helpful to your practices? And I wanted to invite you to think about the stories and the images that you might want or be responding to in each other's works.
Well, I think Rod's film was a great example of telling a story through people's eyes. We produce the graphs of relative sea level rise. We can show it's a foot in the last 100 years, and we can look at projections and beautiful graphs. It's not very real. It's like, well, what's an inch? So what? And it's through the eyes of peoples whose lives have been dramatically affected that the story becomes real. So I think the stories we tell each other have to have a human dimension to be as meaningful.
I think I would also add, I agree, that the often maligned media does play an important role, and I think we're starting to see a change here in the U.S. at least, from a certain false objectivity about climate change to a commitment to reporting the urgency, and I think that does make things feel more present in a more distributed way. But I'm saying that from here, where probably in the Eastern Seaboard there was already different kinds of reportage than there might be in other places. But I do think that the media controls some of the narratives and can play a positive role if it hasn't in the past.
And urgency, not crisis, as Rod said.
That's right, and that's where if we think of different kinds of media, I think so much of the solutions come from the bottom up. We see the it's networked media, it's people on the ground, and it's the conversations. The storytelling has to happen at a level where you reach people directly, because it is a bit hopeless in a way dealing with the top-down situation with media in the US, at least. A little bit different maybe elsewhere. But there is something about storytelling that's part of that, and having the formats. The top-down media formats aren't very open storytelling formats. And what we see with everyone, in fact, almost everyone in this room is invested in some way in storytelling that I know here, in their different fields, and how to making those stories accessible across disciplines, but more so across their people they're working with, to go out and tell stories online through other forms, because we need a different story. We may need another different teaching system. We certainly need another storytelling system, and a way that we can actually understand each other's stories. And it's through people, but it's also the story of research is quite hard sometimes to translate in ways that artists and humans can digest. So there's also a way where we want to understand each other's stories, but don't necessarily get the structures of how to understand them.
I want to pick up on this question of the story of research and how difficult it can be to communicate it, both across various modes of research, methods of research, and disciplinary cultures, but also, of course, to wider non-academic, non-research communities. The question I kind of wanted to ask you is, first of all, cross-disciplinary collaboration takes forever. Like, it takes a really long time. It's hard to build up a shared language where you can even talk to each other. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about do you do it? Is it worth it? Do you have some advice, maybe, quite practically? But also pointing to useful failures. I think that's also really important in thinking about, I think, this kind of widely shared discussion, or even a shared sense that we need to do better, we need to move beyond the arts and sciences, and yet there's also this sense that we, particularly in the humanities, need to push back against an instrumentalization of knowledge, and to really argue for the great value of critique and humanist modes of perception. So I'm sort of wondering, do you do cross-disciplinary research more actively? Would you make a case for it? Do you think it's a way of undermining humanistic modes of knowing and teaching? This is a question more for the humanists, Bill. And then, do you suffer from disciplinary fatigue?
There tends to be more funding for scientists to bring an artist along than for artists to bring a scientist along. And this is unfortunate, because many times it's great to go out and talk, have a conversation, maybe visit a scientist in action, but when you're starting a big art project, say, or a big arts and humanities project, to actually be able to invite people in a context that is actually supported, there's not a lot of opportunities for that. It goes the other way. So that's a curious, slight anomaly in the system. There is, I think, I'm not sure what it's in the there's this whole, right now, the arts, there's actually quite a lot of opportunity to go out and create works that engage in a cultural way, because we're in a period of media expansion. But that comes at the same time, there's also this incredible weight against the value of science in the what should we say, certain aspect of the press. And that's had a big weight on us in culture of how to, all tell these stories together, but also to find the audiences that see a value in the stories. So the problem, it seems to be, the interdisciplinary problem of working together is also a problem of the cultural context in which we're invited to work together beyond isolated settings.
My own experience is, my one limited time working with scientists was at the Saras Institute, for whom I'm very grateful. That said, I would say I think it remained a little bit more aspirational. I felt like we both wanted to collaborate, but I'm not sure that we effectively did. We just coexisted and exchanged information, but didn't kind of co-produce anything. But I had an experience teaching environmental humanities this fall with a majority scientist undergraduate population that I thought was interesting, because there I felt For example, the novel I mentioned by Kim Stanley Robinson, imagining New York in 50 years or 40 years, 20 years, whatever it's supposed to be, underwater, while I think a deeply flawed novel, did a good job for the students of kind of making real a potential world. So I feel like maybe art, perhaps more than criticism, is a space for really making manifest scientific information, which he'd clearly researched a lot for the novel. So I thought that was a productive way forward.
Well, I just want to say that in the first part of the 20th century, engineers did amazing things. We built the dams, built the great road networks and nuclear power plants, all these things that were going to solve all the world's problems. And then the scientists in the latter part of the century were there to, cure cancer. Didn't quite work out that way, but, that was the promise. To do these amazing transformative things. And of course, the engineers created problems, and scientists have created problems. We need to move somewhere else to next generation of issues that we face on the planet. And the science gave us the Green Revolution. We can feed more people. Now we have 8 billion people on the planet. How are we going to deal with that? So we've got to get beyond our disciplines, got to get way beyond what's caused a problem to be able to solve the next generation of problems.
There are some really shared areas. So we really need to think about, say, the visual thinking. All our presentations were a lot about visual thinking and the need to build that together. And that, there are a lot of these areas where we actually do seem to share a lot of activity. Yet, and then there's this other thing of actually understanding the stories that go with them. I think it's the experience of at least putting together classes and projects that people come together around a cluster. That seems very viable. It's this next step of how do you extend that into a larger format where it often runs up to a barrier.
We've developed those conceptual diagrams entirely for the reason that if I put up an XY graph or a pie diagram, there's the scientist talking at people. If I put up a conceptual diagram, then there's a two-way conversation. Now, I think that fish should be over here. That water should be over there. That color's wrong. And I think we have to create those visualizations and those narratives that invite collaborative learning, co-learning.
I think that really feeds in really nicely to two of the questions that are popping up on Menti, both about toxic narratives and disabling narratives, I would say. How the question all the way on the right, how can narratives, words and images work together to convey urgency without deploying fear, but inviting action? And I think you're starting to address that, but I'd like you to think it through a little bit more. I think that also really opens up this question between, is the division between mimetic and non-mimetic really that clearly cut? And then the question in the middle that we have also on critical narratives, the kind of, I would call them maybe the techno-narratives of carbon and its agents versus stories of larger system change. Those are broad questions about narratives. We've heard from each of you a bit about the importance of open-ended and invitational forms. But of course, with maybe you're all also storytellers in your spare time or your full time or whatever, but I'm really thinking about the work of research here. Like, how do you actually convey narratives about research that don't make it too facile?
Well, I'll easy question. That's why we're jumping in on this. This is what I spent most of my career trying to figure out how to do. So I got a graduate student buddy from when we were grad students together that went off to Hollywood, and then he came back to science. His name's Randy Olson, and he and I we went to Australia together, and then he came back. And went to Hollywood to figure out how to make films. After he had gotten tenure from doing science, he said, I got to do something else. And he wrote a book called Houston, We Have a Narrative. And it's the title of the book's kind of twist on the Apollo 13 line, Houston, we have a problem. And it turns out that's not really the line that was spoken by the astronauts. It was, Houston, we've had a problem here. And so Hollywood turned it to Houston, we have a problem, period. Make it more compelling, more immediate. So they're telling the story better than reality. And what Randy has done is analyzed a series of speeches. Well, we together went and looked at Nobel laureate speeches and people like Darwin and his counterpart, Alfred Wallace. And we found that you can divide stories into an and, but, therefore narrative, ABT. If anybody heard of an ABT? So if you tell a story, just remember, set it up with an and, create tension with a but statement, and resolve it with a therefore. So, the waters are rising, sea levels expanding, and it's encroaching on our cities, but we have people that are in harm's way, that are getting flooded and inundated. Therefore, we have to figure out solutions to move the people or resist the water. So you create stories with this and, but, therefore, and he's taken it through all the movies and the Gettysburg Address, Martin Luther King's famous speech. So I think there are ways that we can learn how to do it better. I think this is what he's using the scientific approach. Can we tell stories better than we have before?
I could give maybe think of three methodological issues that have come up in different projects. In one of the things that for a while I was working in Africa, in West Africa, on issues of political imagery and its presence in culture, doing standard ethnography, and there's tremendous frustration with the sort of how to directly describe the power of images from abroad in imposing authority on people. And so one of the approaches that became very valuable was to work from what's called metaphor theory, work with on-the-ground language use to build up meaning structures, clusters of structures that redefined these big images from the top down, resituate them in relationship to local power structures, and in a sense destabilize them. And so the new technologies at that time in the 90s of early interactivity in creating web structures, hypercard structures, allowed for a breaking up of this sort of authority, and the ethnography on the ground that we were doing could now get, in a way, filtered and spread apart. In the early 2000s, I was involved in a project on land use in the American Southwest, and here where they were tackling particularly some large industrial projects along the Colorado River, nuclear waste seeping into the water and so forth, and all of this out of view, because one of the things about the Southwest is a big space, and as long as they can cut you off at the main road, you never see what's happening. So we started creating imagined or new kinds of maps filled with stories, and maps actually that drew on 19th century mapping the models to, in a way, undermine the authority of those sort of barriers and take people on back routes up to these sites, which I find really even more exciting is actually this sort of the mobile chances we have now of taking people on tours that are, in a way, storytelling tours through areas with research supporting the material. In the early 2010s, I was working on a human rights issue with political scientists who were working with evidence of human rights abuse and torture in Iraq. And there, the immersive environment allowed those stories to be situated in a way that you could experience their intensity, but didn't have to but could also sit and digest it. It allowed for these, the cave experience allowed for a way to settle in with the story, to create the dynamic performance of the events, to absorb material. And I think a lot of, in terms of resilience, in terms of digesting without just rejecting, it's also creating this the experience of receiving information where we can have time to respond, accept, discuss, without this sort of just media onslaught that is what happens in mass media, or what happens with the lecture format and so forth, that how, in fact, all of these various technologies and conditions allowed for a shift in the way we could take in the research and make it, in a way, a different kind of story.
It sounds a little bit like what you're gesturing to is the importance of shared intimate spaces also, and that the large sort of dematerialized non-physical being together isn't what you're after. It's this shared sense of being together. And that leads me towards this a couple of questions that I'm seeing here about the importance of thinking about who is this we that we're talking about, who are we working with and making stories with. And there's a certain sort of obvious tension, I think, between the universalizing modes of science communication and storytelling and deeply culturally situated, intimate, humanistic, maybe more humanist modes. And I wanted to just invite maybe Rachel in particular, but all of you really to think about this, that I was thinking about this, Bill, when you were talking about ABT, that there's a certain presumption that that structure works universally across time and place. And of course, if we think about some of the beautifully specific projects situated in Havana or wherever, other projects, I wonder if that might work. And I might ask Rachel to really think that through first. There's some people who are eager here to have you talk specifically, and then open it up to all three of you.
Okay, sure. Well, one thing I would start with, echoing earlier comments about bottom-up work, is the man and the program I mentioned earlier, the Malik Rahim and the Common Ground. What I think is really important from that experience, it's like a positive out of a negative, which is that he drew on his earlier training as being a member of the Black Panthers to instantly be able to mobilize a kind of ground-up form of mutual assistance in the absence of local and state and federal productive intervention after Katrina. So that's an example in terms of collective knowledge sharing and resilience that very much, because of a history of exclusion, had the tools to work in the absence of the state. But I don't want to be a kind of just championing very local stuff, because I think there's a lot of problems we're facing whose scale demands really the kind of coordination that only local groups can't do. So I think it's sort of a combination in terms of a certain specificity and a certain globality. Even the question of the toxicity, everywhere has been affected by the Anthropocene, whether or not we think of it as a site that's been directly impacted. So in terms of, you had mentioned some of the questions about the specificity of other approaches. So I guess that was one argument I was trying to make, was instead of merely critique, I think we need to put forward or privilege or make more visible other approaches. And that can vary from place to place. I mean, that's sort of what the theories of the rights of nature we're drawing on. But even in the Michael Martyr concept, he's really known as the philosopher of plants. And what he finds in plants is a mode of energy and use of energy that's alternative to this dunamis model. So I think he's an example of offering a way of thinking differently based on something that's already existing. So that's my answer.
I just wanted to also shout out to the parkour tomorrow, where we're invited to think with and as plants. So stay tuned for that.
I'd like to talk to the universality of story and of visual. Our brains have evolved to appreciate story. And this is documented with MRIs. You put people in a room and you watch an Alfred Hitchcock movie, and you put you change the movie and you make it a movie of people, a random video of people in a shopping mall. while they're watching the movie of Alfred Hitchcock, their brains are lit up, and they're lit up the same way. Watching a movie of random stuff, they're not lighting up, or if they are, they're randomly lighting up. So the story, the power of Alfred Hitchcock is that people are tense, suspenseful, and they're watching. Same with color. If you put people in a room that's entirely red, blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up. You put people, and that's Chinese people that like red, and Europeans and Africans. You put people in a green room, and the heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down. That's why you go to the green room before you go on stage to calm you down. So these are universal. These are hardwired into our brains. This is physiology. It's biology. It's not psychology. We have biologically adapted to listen to, hear stories, and to look at color and visuals in a very powerful way. And that's what's universal about it.
I want to pick up on some of the questions about the democratizing science. Science is in some ways, of course, a story that we also tell that's about progress and making the world better, curing cancer, as you said, maybe the engineer as hero and sort of mass dam building or nuclear projects. That story, I think, is very much under pressure, as you also indicated. There's a question here, I think, that we can kind of put together out of the two on the bottom right that are about what it would mean to really pluralize maybe research or pluralize science, partially by having more scientists who look different, who inhabit different subject positions, but also by changing the story of what it means to be a scientist and the types of questions and prompts that you might research. The question is put quite nicely here: how would our research and stories change if we include the idea of diversity? And I just wanted to think about that together with you.
And I first apologize for putting the dead white men slide, because science was exclusive. Copernicus and Galileo they were not allowed to get married. It was only males, and it was unmarried males. Now, Galileo had an affair and had 3 kids, but that wasn't legal back then. So science has been protected and it's been a male thing for hundreds of years. Now we've, since Marie Curie and amazing women scientists have come along, we've opened it up somewhat, but it's still got a wall. We put our journals behind paywalls. We put our PhD and master's level requirements to enter, this huge. Yet science is a very human thing. I think we need more citizen science and more people trained in ability to do science without advanced degrees, without paywalls, and open it up. And I do believe we need to diversify it.
I also think it's a problem that's particularly pronounced here, for example, because in other places where I wouldn't use the word diverse, but just where people are not white, there are a lot of non-white scientists, and I think there's an image that's being repeated in these spheres of a certain vision of a history of science, but I think the diversity, as it were, already exists. It's just maybe a question of representation too.
Only that I was just talking to Peter a bit earlier. I think you'll talk more tomorrow. But from your summer courses where you take people out on the river, and this response that of a person who otherwise had been scared of science their whole life, being involved in a hands-on practical engagement with scientists together and discovering, wow, I wish I hadn't been afraid and done this. But we do have the sense of being afraid to join certain groups, and the opportunities to break those aren't necessarily the traditional classroom. They are these other structures, like taking them out, doing intensive projects together that involve crisscrossing each other's paradigms, and discovering the value of different specializations. And that's something very powerful. I don't know if you want to bring that in now, but it is actually something to bring to it, because there are very different models of learning that break down some of these barriers.
I mean, I think one of the things that maybe you're also getting at is doing philosophy outdoors or doing science outdoors beyond the lab. And I think that's very much related to this question in the left corner, actually, which is getting at the kind of academic spaces as a kind of privileged preserve. And here the question is specifically using the category of settler colonialism, or that enduring structure of the ways that academic privilege and academic authority reinforces long-standing structures of structural violence. And the question is put quite appropriately, bluntly here, which is what work do settler academics and artists need to do in order to redress the histories of violence they're tied to? I think this is very much bound together with the questions that we have discussed in preparation for this, which is also about, I think, one of the garbage stories that I realized that I had been telling myself was that there was something inherently progressive, again, that word progress, about being an academic. I grew up on that, thinking that that was something that meant to be left, and realizing that actually that it really probably isn't the case, and that I was part of the problem rather than part of the solution, and that was a really kind of shocking realization. I wonder about how you think that those questions through. I think they're especially difficult now because they're also cut through with a very different critique of academic expertise, which is that science is bunk and climate change is fake. And so there's multiple strands that are pulling on what it means to be an expert. I would say maybe from the left and from the right, quite different, but yet putting pressure on what it means to be an academic today. Questions of responsibility, histories of violence. How do you approach that in the own type of work that you make?
Well, first, the question is, we might want to talk more about the questions because it's so much about the institutions we're a part of. And if it's, academia grows with the Industrial Revolution and with the violence to the environment that happens now is the legacy of the mindset we've been living with since the mid-19th century, early 19th century. And there is a way in which the apparatus that supports the overall systems of what we do invites us to gain the expertise or authority to get the funding to be in the position to keep doing the thing we do, which, as you say, there's always this threat of, well, let's just debunk it and destroy it. How do you hold on to the value and the funding and the practicalities? Well, it's all part of the same gimmick. So the question you're asking is quite a revolutionary one in a sense, I think, because you're suggesting, well, okay, so what if we don't have that system, but we instead have some other way to have meaningful and deep scientific research and deeply contextualize it with storytelling? What would that look like, right?
How do we keep the boat afloat but rebuild it without sinking?
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really appreciate the questions that we're getting, and I lament that we don't have the time to answer them, but it reminded me of this famous Cuban film from the 1960s, Memory of Underdevelopment, where there's a round table and then somebody stands up and says, if this is supposed to be a revolution, how come we're still doing this round table? And I just want to say that I think part of this question of democratizing knowledge would be for us somehow to appropriately answer the different questions in our necessarily limited time. But I just wanted to say I feel like a lot of the things being pointed out are really central questions for this whole conference and for what we're all doing.
I think the comments are more erudite than anything I've said, so I'm a little intimidated by you guys. I think you guys have really hit the mark. I want to just talk about disciplinarity for a second, because I've recently, I got involved for 10 years in this Healthy Waterways effort in Australia, and I never used the word transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't care. And I didn't but in retrospect, now that I've read the literature and I taught a class in it, so I forced myself to read it all, I found out that, oh yeah, that's the academic way of saying you're engaging and environmental problem solving with other people. And so, you know, academia is as the corpus of knowledge increases, we tend to want to sliver it up into smaller bits. And that's, you know, why we have departments and why we have, you know, colleges within universities, and we divide things up. And I think that's the challenge when you go to do environmental problem solving in the world I work in. It doesn't matter whether it's the physics or the chemistry or the social science that needs to be employed, you still have to go figure it out. And I think we approach I would never approach the nomadic herdsmen that we worked with in Mongolia to figure out how to deal with their water problem in the Tool River and talk about transdisciplinary. You know, I'll talk about water, I'll talk about their animal herding behavior strategies, but they don't want to know anything about transdisciplinary. They don't want to know a social network analysis. That doesn't mean anything to them. So what I feel that we have to think about doing is in the co-production of knowledge is use the terminology, use the expressions that the people you're working with are comfortable with. Because if we bring our science jargon in there, it's just going to turn them off, and they're going to go back to their yurts and leave you alone. So I think I'm going to say anti-disciplinary. I like that. I'm going to endorse that. Whoever said that, I'm with you.
I think the anti-disciplinary sentiment is a perfect one to head into a reception with, actually. And I really thank all of you for these really remarkable remarks. They will continue with us over the next 2 days as we collaborate and co-produce knowledge beyond and with disciplines.